On March 27, 1994, in an abandoned well in northern Moldova, a team of tractor drivers discovered the naked body of a woman packed in a heavy-duty bag. From being in dirty, stagnant water for a long time, the tissues of the woman's body and face had decomposed so much that the corpse was practically falling apart before their eyes. Shocked by the discovery, the tractor drivers immediately called the police and the body was sent for autopsy to the nearest morgue. This accidental discovery marked the beginning of a long and complicated investigation into one of the most high-profile and complex cases in the history of Moldovan criminal investigation, the case of Ilia Railean. It is also remarkable because despite the overwhelming amount of evidence, the criminal managed to escape punishment. Text by Black Moose exclusively for the Strashnota channel. 1994, the USSR collapsed 3 years ago and the country is in chaos. The former Soviet republics are formally separated from each other, but they are still connected by common problems. Businesses are shutting down and the population is becoming impoverished. Corruption is everywhere. Corruption has become especially widespread in law enforcement agencies. 99 police officers, prosecutors and judges took and gave bribes. Court hearings have become a sham. People's fates were decided not in the courtroom but behind closed office doors when green bills changed hands. It was during that turbulent period that the former Soviet Moldavian Republic, now the Republic of Moldova, was shaken by a terrible crime. A young woman, mother of 3 children, was killed. The family it happened to seemed completely ordinary at first glance. A wife, a husband and 3 sons. Like many men in those years, the husband, Anatoly, lost his job because the company closed down. The wife, Nina, who was an accountant by education, had to work 3 jobs to support the family. She often came home late and would finish the work she didn't manage to do during the day at night. Nina was an amazing beauty, admired by both men and women. The remarkable features of her appearance were her long, below-the-waist, shiny chestnut hair, which she often wore braided. Her husband Anatoly adored Nina and willingly took on the household duties, understanding that it was hard for his wife to work and manage the house. It seemed that love reigned in their family. On February 15, 1994, Nina left for work in the morning as usual, but when evening came, she didn't return home. Anatoly waited for her all night. The era of mobile communication had not yet arrived and they didn't have a home phone. When morning came and Nina still hadn't appeared, the man went to the only payphone in the village and called his wife's sister, Irina. Irina didn't hesitate for a second. "I know for sure that something happened to Nina," she told Anatoly. "I'm certain she's no longer alive." When the worried man asked her why she was so sure, Irina said that for several days she had been tormented by nightmares in which Nina was dying. Anatoly didn't believe in mysticism, but he couldn't ignore his sister-in-law's words, especially since Nina was a faithful wife and mother. If she didn't come home at night, then something serious must have happened. After talking with Anatoly, Irina immediately called the law office where Nina worked and told them about the situation. They told her that the police would not accept a missing person report until 3 days had passed since Nina disappeared, and recommended that she wait. Who knows, maybe Nina will come home, and everything will be turned out alright. But Irina was not going to sit and wait for her sister to return. There was something else besides the nightmares that told her something terrible had happened to Nina. She didn't tell Anatoly because she was afraid of his reaction. But Nina had a lover, a traffic police officer named Ilia Railean. Irina knew that her sister wanted to break up with Ilia on that fateful day. She had no doubts. If anyone took Nina's life, it was Ilia Railean. Nina Yegorova and Ilia Railean met in 1993, a year before the events described. That day, the woman missed the bus she usually took to work in Chisinau and decided to hitchhike. The driver of the car was Ilia Railean. He was in a police uniform, behaved decently, and drove Nina to the suburbs without any problems. On the way, the man gave her a couple of compliments and offered to meet her at the bus stop the next morning and give her a ride again. After all, he needed to go to the city anyway. Nina agreed. There was no talk of falling in love, and with his unremarkable appearance and short stature, Railean could only attract women's attention with his bright red hair. Nina had no intention of cheating on her husband, whom she loved, but she didn't know that from that very first ride she was already doomed. Gradually, by doing small favors for Nina, Railean became a constant presence in her life. He gave Nina a ride whenever she needed to get somewhere urgently, made romantic gestures, brought fruit and champagne, bought inexpensive gifts, and brought treats from his mother in the village, a duck, a chicken, a dozen fresh eggs. He was like a dull grey spider, in whose web a beautiful butterfly had accidentally been caught. Day by day, Railean wrapped Nina in the web of his care, drawing her in tighter and tighter until she finally agreed to become his lover, already burdened by this forced relationship but unable to refuse. Later, a psychological evaluation, conducted for the first time in Moldova during the investigation of this case, would describe the relationship between Railean and Nina as abusive. The domineering and cruel Ilya Railean played the role of the abuser in this relationship, determined to keep his victim close by any means, money, gifts, threats, and if necessary even take her life. From the case materials, the defendant is described by relatives and acquaintances as a ruthless person, incapable of empathy, cruel to both people and animals. Pathologically greedy, he reacts painfully to any unforeseen expenses and considers his own property inviolable. Nina and Railean's meetings took place on Thursdays. She ironically called them fish days, by analogy with the Thursday menu in Soviet cafeterias. Raised in a conservative family, Nina was very afraid that her parents would find out about this relationship, but Railean was getting deeper and deeper into her life. That's how Irina, some colleagues, and a few relatives found out about her lover. Irina was horrified that her sister got involved with such a man and immediately started begging Nina to break up with him. In response, the girl admitted, "I'm afraid of him. I'm afraid that if I even hint that we might break up, he'll kill me." A few days before the disappearance, they saw each other for the last time. Irina saw that her sister was determined, but at the same time full of fear. "I've been having nightmares for several days in a row now," Nina admitted. "I keep seeing myself holding someone else's infant in my arms, stroking and caressing it. That's a bad sign. I'm scared. If something happens to me, please don't abandon my children." Nina spoke as if she was saying goodbye. It was as if she was walking towards certain death. Irina walked her sister to the door and never saw her alive again. Remembering Nina's last words and knowing about Railean's cruelty, Irina called him and asked for a meeting. When Railean arrived, she immediately noticed that something was wrong. He avoided eye contact, looked deadly tired, and behaved strangely. Irina didn't hesitate for a second. "Where is my sister?" "You killed my sister." Naturally, Railean wasn't going to admit anything. He swore that after their date he took Nina to the bus stop as usual and then went on duty, which is why he didn't get enough sleep and looks tired. He even promised Irina he'd help with the search. After all, he's a police officer, he has the resources. After talking with Railean, Irina immediately went to the public transport stop where he supposedly left Nina that evening. Of course, many people remembered the beautiful woman with luxurious hair who left every workday. She would travel from that stop to Chisinau and back. Many people knew Nina by sight. Everyone swore to Irina that they hadn't seen Nina on the evening she disappeared. The woman realized that Railean had lied. When 3 days had passed, Irina and Anatoly filed a missing person report for Nina with the police. And on the 4th day, the phone rang in her house. Railean called Irina. He suggested they meet and seemed strangely excited, as if he knew something. Irina agreed with caution, and when they met, Railean suddenly told her that Nina was fine. "I visited a monk I know. He's a clairvoyant. He told me that Nina is alive and will turn up on her own in 40 days, the man said. And he also said that under no circumstances should we look for her." Nina was indeed found exactly 40 days after her disappearance. Her naked body in a bag was discovered in the village of Trshitsa, in the Teleneshti district in the north of Moldova, in a well that was used by tractor drivers during the agricultural season. Nina was not immediately identified in the body that was found. Due to the long time spent in the water, the body tissues had decomposed significantly. In addition, the body had short hair, so for a long time no one connected the remains to Nina at all. The autopsy results showed that the death was violent and occurred as a result of a blow to the head with a chopping implement, presumably an axe. The injuries found on the body were caused by a car tire tread and were inflicted post-mortem. In other words, it was made to look like a traffic accident. After the autopsy, the woman was buried as an unidentified person. For several weeks, there was an announcement on television about the discovery of a woman's body, asking people to report if anyone could identify her. Irina happened to see this announcement and photograph. Based on some subtle signs, she suspected that it could be the body of her sister. The woman immediately called the police. The body was exhumed, an identification was carried out, and several more examinations were performed. DNA testing at that time was something out of science fiction. It wasn't practiced because the necessary equipment wasn't available in the country's laboratories. Nina's body was identified by the undamaged fragments of her body, by the presence of an intrauterine device, and by her teeth according to her dental records. The case of Nina's disappearance and the criminal case regarding the murder of an unidentified woman were combined, and homicide detectives began working on it. The main suspect immediately became Ilya Railean. It seemed that the case would be solved quickly. The well where Nina's body was found was located near Ilya's home village. His mother lived in this village, and the investigators first searched her house and yard. They seized several bags. The forensic examination determined that they were identical to the one in which Nina's body was found. But of course, this could not serve as evidence. Hair taken from the body was sent for forensic examination. The examination showed that the hair was severed by a chopping instrument, presumably an axe, with considerable physical force. The search for evidence began, and difficulties arose immediately. The investigation was convinced that Railean transported the body in the trunk of his car, and that evidence would be found there. But it turned out that Railean had recently coated the trunk with Mavel, an anti-corrosion agent, supposedly to prevent rust. The experts had to scrape off the Mavel bit by bit. Finally, after incredibly painstaking work, they managed to find several hairs that matched the color, thickness, and structure of the deceased Nina's hair. The ends of the hairs indicated that they had been chopped off with an axe. There was also something suspicious found in Railean's own background. At the very beginning of his career in the traffic police in the 70s, the police received a complaint from a girl whom he had sexually assaulted. On the second day after filing the complaint, the girl disappeared without a trace. They searched for her, but without a body, a murder case could not be opened. Accordingly, the investigation into her complaint of sexual assault was also closed. The investigators working on Nina's case were literally turning over every stone. They searched for the girl, requested information about her throughout the former USSR, but the search led to nothing. Many were sure that the girl had become part of the statistics of thousands of bodies found but never identified, but there was no way to prove it. To rule out possible investigative bias, the version that Nina's husband was involved in her death was also considered. But Anatoly seemed so devastated by his wife's betrayal that they soon abandoned this line of investigation. During the interrogations, the man hardly lifted his eyes from the floor and answered questions very briefly. It seemed that he was shocked not so much by Nina's death as by the shame of her betrayal, which he and the children would now have to live with. During the investigation, witnesses were also questioned. Railean's ex-wife, Emilia, was summoned. Her testimony also indicated that Railean was greedy, cold-blooded, and cruel to everyone, whether people or dogs. As an example, the woman told the investigators that Railean was at home when she went into labor during her pregnancy. When Emilia collapsed to the floor from severe pain and started screaming and asking her husband to call an ambulance, he simply stepped over her and went about his business. The woman also said that Railean had a small black safe in the house, which he always kept locked, and no one but him was allowed to look inside. Tormented by curiosity, Emilia once noticed that her husband had left the safe open and looked inside. What she saw there might not have meant anything by itself, but combined with the fact of Nina's disappearance, it only strengthened the investigators' suspicion that Railean could be the perpetrator. In the safe, there was a pile of women's wristwatches. The straps and glass looked worn, and the watches were clearly not new. Emilia remembered that she had seen at least a couple dozen watches in the safe. Whether these watches belonged to other victims of Railean or if it was just a strange whim remained unknown. One of Nina's colleagues, Anna, said during questioning that Nina had expressed serious concerns for her life and had also told her about bad dreams involving a baby. About a week before her death, Nina asked the woman to consider marrying Anatoly and taking care of her sons if something happened to Nina. Anna confirmed that on that last day Nina was going on a date with Railean and said she was going to tell him that she was breaking up with him. Railean's neighbor testified that on the night of the murder she saw him driving out of the yard. One of Railean's mother's fellow villagers recalled that on the night of the crime she saw his car near his parents' house in the village near where Nina was found in a well. However, for the most part, the witness testimonies were fragmented and did not allow for a complete picture of what had happened. The situation was not helped by the fact that many of Railean's fellow villagers seemed to be afraid to talk about him at all, and investigators soon found out why. Ilya Railean was born in a small village to a peasant family. There were two sons in the family, Ivan and Ilya, and both became police officers. Their late father was known as a hard-working man who often volunteered at the local church and was well respected in the village. Unlike her husband, Railean's mother was considered a real witch by the villagers. The fear of her was so great that if she was the first person someone saw after leaving their house, they would immediately go back home to avoid crossing the witch's path and bringing misfortune upon themselves. Even her close ones suffered from the witch. Ivan's wife said during the interrogation, though not for the record, that his mother was the main problem in their family life. She and Ivan live very peacefully and harmoniously, but as soon as the mother-in-law comes to visit, it's as if some evil force enters the house. The spouses start to argue, anger and hatred grow between them. Of course, both Ivan's wife and Ivan himself provided an alibi for Railean out of family loyalty. They couldn't refute the testimony of the villagers that on the morning of February 16, 1994, Railean's car was parked in the yard of his mother's house. But they insisted that on that day, February 16, he brought a gas cylinder to his mother, meaning he went home on an errand. It may seem that in the progressive 20th century there is no place for superstition and stories about a witch can only scare a child. But then, one after another, people involved in the investigation of Railean's case began to experience health problems. Detectives, the prosecutor's office investigator, the prosecutor who presented the case in court, some of them had to be hospitalized while others surrounded themselves with protective charms and visited monasteries. One of them, a religious man, said that he started having problems with his lower back and lost the use of his leg. His friends, having some idea of what was happening to him, took him to a monastery to a service said to work miracles. In the church, the man experienced strange feelings. Instead of feeling peace, he was suddenly overwhelmed by hatred for everything around him. The man insisted if he had a weapon in his hands at that moment, not a single person in the church would have survived. They led him out of the church, then brought him back in again, but the feeling of hatred didn't go away. Finally, on the way back, just as the car was entering the city, he felt the pain in his lower back go away. Of course, superstition couldn't slow down the investigation. Bit by bit, from the tiniest pieces of evidence, the picture of the crime was reconstructed. On Thursday, February 15, 1990, Ilya Railean picked up Nina from work as usual. When the lovers arrived at Railean's home, Nina, as she intended, told him that this would be their last meeting and that she was breaking up with him. The classic abuser, Railean, could not allow his victim, his property, into whom he had invested money, overcoming even his pathological stinginess, to suddenly slip out of his control. Perhaps at first he tried to persuade Nina, maybe he even threatened her. But the woman, though scared half to death, still remained unyielding, and then, in a fit of rage, Railean struck her on the head with an axe. After taking Nina's life, he cold-bloodedly began to cover up the evidence. As a policeman and simply a pragmatic person, Railean understood that if the body was discovered, suspicion could fall on him. That is why before hiding the body he decided to make its identification more difficult. Many people remembered Nina's long, beautiful hair, and by cutting it off, Railean immediately removed a distinctive feature from the body. After that, he also got rid of the axe. What the criminal did with the victim's cut-off hair is still not known for certain. He may have destroyed them to completely cover his tracks, but it's also possible he kept them as a memento, just like he kept dozens of women's wristwatches in his home safe. The second task, which was actually the most important, was to get rid of the body. It was preferable to hide Nina's body somewhere it wouldn't be found for a long time, and where it would decompose much faster. But simply throwing the body into the water and hoping it wouldn't float up was clearly not an option. It needed to be wrapped up. For help, Railean decided to go to the most important person in his life, his mother. After stuffing Nina's corpse into the trunk, he set off. Maybe it was then, or maybe later, that the idea came to him to cover up the crime and stage a car accident. Stopping along the way, Railean pulled his lover's body out of the trunk and ran it over with his car. Already in his mother's yard, Railean undressed Nina and put her naked body in a bag. He burned her clothes. The investigation was certain that he couldn't have packed the body so compactly without outside help, so it was almost certain that his mother helped him with this. After loading the bag with the body into the trunk, Railean headed toward the farmland. He knew the area well and was aware of a well far out in the field. He also knew that this well had previously only been used by farm crews during fieldwork, but now it was abandoned, hadn't been cleaned in a long time, and the water in it was very dirty. Railean was sure that Nina would never be found. The body in the water would decompose beyond recognition very quickly. Railean might have thought that the well was the perfect option, but chance intervened. Early spring of 1994, the tractors went out into the fields early, and one of the tractors had a radiator leak, which meant they immediately needed water of any quality. The tractor drivers lowered a bucket into the well and saw that there was a tightly packed sack floating in the water. Using hooks, they managed to catch it and pull it out. It was the 40th day since Nina's death. Despite the apparent abundance of evidence, in the end there was not a single direct piece of evidence in the case, not a single indisputable piece of evidence. Even the expert examinations at that time did not provide clear answers. However, the number of circumstantial pieces of evidence was so great that the prosecutor considered it sufficient to detain Railean and send the case to court. The corrupt judicial system, rubbing its hands in anticipation of large bribes, took up the case. Before his arrest, Railean managed to give his lawyer, who was quite famous at the time, a power of attorney to sell his Mercedes 190 and his second apartment. Both the car and the apartment were sold immediately. And on the very first day of the trial, at the request of his lawyer, Railean's preventive measure was changed from detention to a written pledge not to leave the area. While the trial was ongoing, Railean's lawyer managed to write and publish a short story based on this case in the Moldovan literary magazine Nistru with the epigraph, "There is no sadder story in the world than the story of Romeo and Juliet." The story was about the great love between a man and a woman and about how the man was unjustly accused of taking this woman's life. The final words of the story were, "The court acquitted him." The lawyer turned out to be a prophet. A month after the story was published, the court really did deliver an acquittal in the case of Railean. The murderer who took the life of a mother of 3 children was released. But it was too soon for Railean to celebrate his victory. The prosecutor filed an appeal, the verdict was overturned, and the case was sent for a new trial. Since the verdict was overturned, things soured between Railean and his lawyer. Railean signed a contract with another lawyer, and the previous lawyer wrote a sequel to the story. It began with the words, "But in reality, everything was different." Then the author went into detail about how the main character took the life of his beloved. In any case, the case was sent for a new trial. And due to its increased complexity and public attention, a panel of first-instance judges was created. Now the corrupt courts seemingly could no longer turn a blind eye to the evidence. At the very first court session, the prosecutor moved to change his detention status, and Railean was taken into custody right in the courtroom. After 6 months of proceedings, the court delivered a guilty verdict and sentenced him to 18 years in prison. It seemed that now Railean would not be able to escape responsibility, but he knew all too well just how deeply rotten the entire justice system really was. There was always someone in it who was willing to take a large sum of money. Railean gave his new lawyer a power of attorney to sell another one of his apartments. It was successfully sold, and the appellate court overturned the verdict of the first instance, issuing its own verdict by which Railean was acquitted and released from custody right there in the courtroom. The prosecutor's office immediately filed an appeal with the Supreme Court, and the acquittal was overturned, but the opportunity had already been missed. Railean decided not to tempt fate and went into hiding. The search for him went on for a long time, but without success. They said he was seen in Moscow back in the 2000s, but no trail could be found. Ilya Railean is still hiding from justice somewhere in Russia, unless he has died. Maybe he came to his senses, repented, started a new family and began a new life. Or maybe he just bought himself a new safe, which he's filling up again with worn women's watches. Railean's mother lost her mind soon after her son disappeared. Day after day she walked under the windows of her second son's house, Ivana, and she shouted terrible curses. In the village, people said that God's punishment had finally caught up with her. Nina's betrayal hurt her husband so deeply that he didn't forgive her even after her death. Nina's grave in the cemetery of her hometown suburb is always lonely. Neither Anatoly nor the children ever came to visit her. Only Irina still visits her sister's grave on Memorial Days and mourns the life she lost too soon. In 2007 to 2011, a series of crimes that shocked the public took place in the Republic of Moldova. Despite the fact that the victims were people of different ages and genders, all the crimes had the clear signature of a maniac, and some even had a terrifying common detail. The criminal chose young couples in love as his victims. Since the time of the first crime, the investigation has had almost 800 suspects in the case. 850 searches were conducted, and one suspect who turned out to be innocent was convicted and spent more than 5 years in prison. The press dubbed the criminal the Durlești Maniac after the suburb of Chișinău where most of the crimes took place. More than 10 years later, this once high-profile case still remains unsolved. The criminal found his first victims, or so it was initially thought, in September 2010 by the lake stretching along the Chișinău-Ialoveni highway. 31-year-old Valeri Cruitaru and his lover, 19-year-old Mariana Jimbe, came to the lakeshore in Valeri's car to spend some time together. A deserted place night, perfect conditions for any crime. Even if the victim starts screaming, no one will hear, and if anything happened, there'd be no one to help. The car and 2 bodies next to it were discovered by random passers-by. The man's body was lying face down. Mariana's naked body was lying a few meters away from her lover's body. According to the results of the examination, both Valeri and Mariana were shot with a hunting shotgun. At that time, no one thought it was the work of a maniac. The investigation treated the case as an isolated incident, suggesting either jealousy since Valeri was married or robbery as the motive, which seemed more likely because the car's audio equipment was missing. The law set strict deadlines for the investigation of each individual crime. Exceeding these deadlines or failing to solve a crime, especially a serious one, always negatively affects the performance indicators not only of the specific investigator but also of the entire chain of their superiors. And so all the allotted deadlines passed, but in the case of Mariana and Valeri, there wasn't even the slightest lead, let alone a suspect. In fact, it had every chance of turning into another cold case. That's what an unsolved case is called in investigative slang. But in the spring, a new crime occurred. It was the same Chișinău-Ialoveni highway, but instead of the lakeshore, it was the St. Andrew's Monastery, located 80 meters from it. On the morning of March 31, 2011, a police patrol noticed a BMW 5 Series car near the monastery. Inside the car was the lifeless body of 15-year-old Olga Kishlaru with a gunshot wound to the head. When they opened the trunk, the police found another body, that of 19-year-old Ilya Raku. Both the girl and the boy were shot with a hunting rifle, and Ilya was shot twice. Apparently the criminal first killed Ilya, then moved his body into the trunk of the BMW. The body didn't fit, so to make the corpse more compact, the maniac broke both of the dead young man's knee joints. Initially, investigators believed Ilya was the first victim and that it wasn't coincidental. After getting rid of him, the criminal intended to force the defenseless Olya into sexual contact and only after that to kill her as well. However, the forensic examination disproved this version. Olga had not had any sexual contact, neither before her death nor ever. The deceased was a virgin. As in the case with Valery and Mariana, audio equipment disappeared from the car. In addition, that evening, according to his parents, Ilya took a wallet with money and documents with him. It was not found during the search of the body. If the first crime went almost unnoticed by the general public, the tragic death of the two young people shook Chisinau and the suburbs. The young man and woman went to school in the suburb of Durlești. Ilya and Olya, who were kind and caring, were good students and they had many friends. The two loved each other and dreamed of getting married. On that fateful evening, they just wanted to be alone together. The young man and woman were buried in the same grave by mutual decision of their parents, like a bride and groom. Friends created a social media page in memory of Ilya and Olya with their photo together, and soon the wall was filled with hundreds of condolences and memories. The public outcry was so great and the similarity to the previous case was so obvious that the prosecutor's office had to admit it was possible that a maniac was operating in the suburbs of Chisinau hunting loving couples. The two criminal cases were combined into one investigation, and just a month later, the criminal struck again, attacking another couple in love. Fortunately for the victims chosen by the maniac, they managed to escape death. The crime scene was the same as in the first case, the lake near the Chisinau-Ialoveni highway. On May 1st, 2011, a police officer, 25-year-old Igor Kazaku, came to the lake to spend time with his girlfriend, 23-year-old Ekaterina. It was already dark, but the couple in love just couldn't bring themselves to part ways. Sitting with the windows open, the young couple was enjoying the warm spring evening when suddenly a bright flashlight blinded Igor, and a moment later he felt the barrel of a shotgun against his temple. Igor, being an athletic young man, suddenly opened the car door and with a blow managed to throw the attacker off balance. While the criminal was recovering, Igor jumped out of the car. Fearing for Katya's life, he shouted to her, "Run to the village." Then he attacked the criminal himself. They were almost evenly matched. Unable to take the weapon from the attacker, Igor also started to run. Shots rang out behind him and sharp pain burned his leg twice. The young man fell, but he didn't lose his composure. He pulled out his air pistol and returned fire. Surprised by the resistance, the criminal chose to flee. It was dark and Igor couldn't see where he had gone. The killer ran away. For a moment, it seemed to him that he heard the sound of a moped or motorcycle driving away in the darkness, but it could have been someone just passing by on the road. Igor called the police and medics and he was taken to the emergency hospital in Chisinau, where pellets were removed from his leg. The man spent more than a month in the hospital. During the interrogation, Igor couldn't clearly describe the attacker's appearance, but he said the person was of average or slightly above average height, had a solid build, and was physically strong. He was dressed in camouflage clothing. As for Ekaterina, after the attack she was slightly shocked but unharmed. Because of the fright at first, the girl couldn't recall any features of the attacker. Later, she said that the attacker was a large man with a scar on his face. Whether she actually saw the scar or just thought she did in the darkness is unknown. The examination established that the criminal fired from exactly the same type of hunting rifle as in the attacks on the previous 2 days. Two crimes that are completely similar could, though that would be a stretch, be described simply as a coincidence. But from the third incident on, investigators no longer had any doubt that a maniac was at work. However, it soon became clear that the maniac might have far more victims than initially thought. After rummaging through the investigators' safes, the prosecutor's office brought to light a suspended case about the killing of a man in 2009. He was found dead in his own car parked on the territory of a vineyard with 4 gunshot wounds to the head. The shots were fired from a hunting rifle. Another incident, which was later also attributed to the Durlești maniac's attacks, ended well for the person involved. In that same year, 2009, an unknown person tried to break into a car using a rifle while its owner was inside. The frightened man jumped out of the car and ran away trying to save his life. The criminal stole the car radio and fled. The investigation later agreed that the car owner survived because the incident did not happen in a deserted place but in a parking lot near a house that is, in a busy area. The criminal did not dare to shoot where he could easily be heard. In these two earlier crimes, the weapon and the method of committing them matched, but there was a clear discrepancy in the choice of target. It became urgent to create a psychological profile of the criminal. Psychologists joined the investigation. From the forensic psychologist's explanation, for a person prone to maniacal crimes, the desire to cause death is just as much an addiction as dependence on alcohol or illegal substances. When such a person takes a victim's life for the first time, it triggers a powerful adrenaline rush in the blood. This creates a state similar to a drug-induced high. And just like an alcoholic or drug addict deprived of their dose, a maniac who hasn't experienced this high for a long time begins to suffer from withdrawal. A strong psychological urge to repeat it develops. The desire to feel intense emotions again becomes stronger and stronger. And soon the criminal can't think about anything else. His range of motivations narrows. His entire life becomes subordinated to the single desire to find the next victim. At some point he endured. The strong one loses control of the situation and grabs any suitable opportunity. It's difficult to say why the Durlești maniac chose couples in love as his victims in 2010 and 2011. However, it's obvious that previously suitable targets for him were also people who were alone. The main thing was that the victim was defenseless and there were no witnesses around. The conclusions of psychologists and the new crimes added to the maniac's record, of course, did not reassure either the investigators or the residents of Minsk, especially since a new frightening incident had just occurred. On August 18, 2011, the body of a 35-year-old woman was found in the stairwell of a 12-story building in the city of Chisinau. According to the forensic report, the cause of death was a gunshot wound to the abdomen from a hunting shotgun. According to the residents, the shot was heard at night, after which the people living on the first floor saw a large-built man with a mask on his face running out of the building. Since the criminal shot the victim not in the head but in the abdomen and the killing did not take place in a deserted area, the investigation concluded that the circumstances of the crime did not fit the pattern of the Durlești maniac. However, the locals were not ready to believe these explanations so easily. Fear settled in Chisinau and its suburbs. Men were afraid to go outside in the evenings to take out the trash. Women were afraid to let their husbands go to work on the night shift. People demanded that the dangerous criminal be found immediately before there were more victims. The investigation into the Durlești maniac case took place during an extremely tense period in Moldovan history. Mass anti-government rallies, dubbed the Twitter revolution in the Western press, had just ended. As a result of the revolution, a temporary coalition government was formed twice. Early parliamentary elections were held twice. As a result, in just 2 years, the country's top officials changed at least 4 times, including the Prosecutor General, the Minister of Internal Affairs, the Minister of Justice, and the heads of the Appellate and Supreme Courts. In the prosecutor's office and the Ministry of Internal Affairs, after top officials, middle management was also regularly replaced. Every newly appointed chief considered it his duty to assure the frightened compatriots that the Durlești maniac would soon be caught and put in prison. But such promises were driven not only by the desire to catch the dangerous criminal as soon as possible. The lower-level leaders also pressured the higher-level ones. One after another, orders came down from above demanding that the Durlești case be solved immediately by any means necessary. Ill-considered orders with unrealistic deadlines led to a real frenzy of arrests and searches all over Chisinau and its suburbs. The arrest of yet another suspect was announced with great pomp on Moldovan television, and then quietly, without any fanfare, the innocent person was released and sent home. The desperate parents of Ilia Racu and Olga Kishlaru, in a last hope to find the criminal, wrote to the Russian reality show Psychics Investigate, which was at its peak of popularity at the time. The case was high profile and interesting, so the show's producers eagerly responded to the call. A team of parapsychologists arrived in Chisinau, among whom was Ziradin Rzaev, a finalist of the 6th season of Battle of the Psychics. Rzaev and the winner of the same season, Alexander Litvin. Together with the relatives of the victims, the psychics traveled around the city, visited the places where the young man and woman spent time, and stopped by the crime scene. They only overlooked the Hyperion Lyceum, where Olya and Ilya studied. Parents, relatives, and friends waited with bated breath for the reputed psychics to provide at least some information about the criminal, any clue at all. But the psychics didn't offer anything specific. After retelling all the known facts about the victims, Ziradin Razayev stated that he saw an abandoned house where the suspect might be hiding, and that this house could be identified by a bunch of garlic the criminal had hung above the door. The maniac remains in Durlești, Razayev stated confidently.
And where is he now?
Somewhere in the city.
He's here. In the city, couples in love remind him of his own unhappy love, and by dealing with them, he tries to drown out his depression.
I feel sorry sometimes because he suffers too. He suffers a lot. And when he kills, it gets a little easier for him. And then he suffers again, and then he kills again.
According to the psychic, the maniac was a man between 35 and 45 years old, grey-haired, large build, very confident in himself. He also pointed out that the criminal has scars on his face, which confirmed what Yekaterina, who survived the attack, had told investigators earlier. Alexander Litvin partially confirmed the conclusions of his colleague and promised the relatives of Molly and Ilya that the criminal would be caught very soon.
He will definitely be arrested, I have no doubt. The police will catch him when he slips up on something minor.
Both psychics warned that before he is caught, he will manage to add at least one more couple to his list. Of course, it was impossible to build an investigation based solely on the psychic's words, but they did stir up public emotions. The residents of the capital began to demand results from law enforcement with renewed vigor, and dissatisfaction with the inaction and helplessness of the investigative authorities grew louder. People needed an answer, so the prosecutor's office, university, and Ministry of Internal Affairs worked with extra zeal. One after another, psychological examinations were conducted, meetings with law enforcement agencies of the CIS were held, and the psychological profile of the criminal was reviewed again. The investigation was hindered because they couldn't determine the maniac's motives. Several theories were considered at once, but many of them were dismissed at an early stage, and there was not enough evidence for the others. Based on the results of these examinations and consultations, as well as the testimonies of Igor Kazaku and his girlfriend Ekaterina, the investigation formed a final profile of the maniac. A man between 30 and 40 years old, a former military man, or someone with a criminal background, skilled in handling smoothbore firearms, physically strong and suffering from a mental disorder. Now they needed to find a suitable suspect. Throughout the entire investigation, several hundred suspects were considered, but there are a few names that came up especially often. The first such suspect was 39-year-old Georgy Inkulits, whom the police began searching for immediately after the deaths of Ilya Raku and Olga Kishla. Inkulits lived in Durlești, had a medical education, and once worked as a doctor. In 2000, he took the lives of his sister and her 2-year-old child and threw their bodies into a well. After that, he was declared insane and sent for compulsory treatment in a closed psychiatric institution. He stayed there for about 8 years, and in 2007 he escaped from the hospital and disappeared. Since he had a previous conviction in a similar case and met other criteria, his name was repeatedly mentioned during the investigation. Georgy Inkulits was wanted until 2012 when it became known that he had died. As it turned out, the man had died back in 2007. At that time, a body was found near the Republican Psychiatric Hospital, which could not be identified and was buried in the local cemetery. That body turned out to be Inkulits. Therefore, the man could not have been the Durlești maniac. Other well-known suspects were the brothers Vladimir and Yevgeny Fedoruk. Both were charged in the case involving Valery Croitoru and Mariana Zhembei. Without first being questioned, they were placed in pre-trial detention. One of the brothers was in Turkey at that time, where he waited for a whole year for extradition to Moldova. The second brother, who was mentally ill, was placed in a psychiatric hospital. The investigation later claimed that they had grounds to detain the brothers, but in any case, at the beginning of 2013, both Fedoruk brothers were released due to lack of evidence of guilt. The most well-known and high-profile episode in the investigation was the trial of Andrei Crechon, although at first no one connected him with the Durlești maniac. In July 2007, Ștefan Cerescu and Rozan Janiv were inspecting their vineyards when suddenly gunshots rang out. Cerescu was shot in the throat and soon died from his wound, while Janiv was shot in the chest and survived. A resident of Chisinau living nearby, Andrei Creciun, was arrested as a suspect. Investigators were determined to solve the case while the trail was still fresh, and both psychological and physical pressure were used, which Andrei could not withstand. Under pressure and, as it was later revealed, torture, he wrote a confession and went to trial. The trial court reviewed the case in the first instance, and Creciun was sentenced to 21 years in prison. When investigators in 2011 began reopening cases involving crimes similar to those committed by the Durlești maniac, it became clear that the attacks on Cerescu and Janiv were also his doing. It had the same signature and method of execution. This meant that an innocent person was in prison. In 2013, 5 years and 8 months after Andrei Creciun ended up behind bars, the Chisinau Court of Appeals overturned the guilty verdict and, under the pressure of irrefutable evidence of innocence, released the man. Justice was restored, but at a high price. The man spent almost 6 years behind bars, serving time for a crime he did not commit. The proceedings in this case were later combined with the proceedings for all similar incidents from 2009 to 2011. Now, the attack on Cerescu and Janiv is considered the first appearance of the Durlești maniac. At the same time as Creciun's release, a criminal case was initiated against the prosecutor who handled the case and the police officer who forged the documents that led to Andrei's wrongful conviction. In 2017, the case was brought to court and prosecutor Railean was convicted for prosecuting a knowingly innocent person. Police officer Gennady Ababi was found guilty of forging documents in the investigation case. The charges were mostly based on the testimony of Andrei Creciun. In 2019, Railean's lawyer appealed the verdict in the Chisinau Court of Appeals. After reviewing the appeal, the panel of judges found the evidence of Cociu's guilt presented by the prosecution to be insufficient. Creciun's testimony was described as contradictory and vague. On December 11, 2019, the prosecutors and police officers were acquitted, and Cociu soon returned to his position at the Chisinau City Prosecutor's Office. No one from the top management was held accountable for the wrongful conviction of Andrei Creciun. So, an innocent person was convicted and spent almost 6 years in prison, while the real criminal is still at large. By that time, the criminal case about the Durlești maniac already had more than 40 volumes, each with 365 pages. Hundreds of suspects, hundreds of searches, several dozen other crimes solved along the way, and still the elusive criminal who could strike again at any moment. However, by the time Creciun was released, the Durlești maniac had already been inactive for nearly 2 years. Despite all the alarm, the local residents began to calm down, hoping that it was all over. Even the tragedies people had experienced started to fade from memory. The public was reminded of the maniac case again in 2014 after the media published statements from the former prosecutor of Chisinau General and, according to the Soviet ranking system, State Justice Advisor Ivan Dyakov. At that time, Dyakov was the only lawyer in Moldova since 1984 who had undergone special training in solving murders committed under unclear circumstances. Based on his knowledge and experience, he insisted that the murders had stopped, either because the criminal had died or because he was in prison serving time for another crime that was not associated with the Durlești events. Dyakov was considered a disgraced prosecutor at that time because of his conflicts with the leadership. He openly accused the prosecution and investigators of delaying the investigation. According to Dyakov, many arrests and searches in the case were carried out illegally and solely for personal reasons, to silence political opponents or to ruin a business someone wanted shut down. Moreover, the former prosecutor was even ready to name the real Durlești maniac. According to him, it was someone named Alexander Miron, a military officer with the rank of major who worked at the Armed Forces Academy. In August 2011, that is, a month after the last attack by the Durlești maniac, Miron shot his wife with a hunting rifle and was sentenced to 23 years in prison. He is currently serving his sentence, and by the way, the rifle has never been found. Alexander Miron lived in Durlești and had a Japanese motorcycle which allowed him to quickly appear and disappear from the crime scene. The possibility that the criminal had a motorcycle was indicated by Igor Kazaku, who survived the attack. Another point in favor of this theory was that the attack stopped at the same time as Miron's arrest. However, as Dyakov himself noted, his theory was purely a personal opinion and was not based on the case materials. Nevertheless, the investigation looked into this theory and found it unviable. Miron successfully passed the lie detector test, and his fingerprints were not found at the crime scene. He was never officially considered a suspect in the case of the Durlești Maniac. One of the last mentions of the Durlești Maniac case in the media is also associated with Ivan Dyakov. Back in 2019, speaking on one of the Moldovan TV channels, the former prosecutor stated that the criminal has already been in prison for 8 years. The investigation avoids discussing this due to numerous falsifications and manipulations in the Maniac case. According to Dyakov, he asked the parents of Olya Kishlar and Ilya Raku to request a case file from the prosecutor's office, and he intends to bring the investigation to its final conclusion himself. More than 10 years have passed since those events. The case of the Durlești Maniac is under the jurisdiction of the Prosecutor's Office for Combating Organized Crime and Special Cases. And to this day, reports are still occasionally written on the case, and the circle of people who may be involved in those now distant and half-forgotten events is updated. Forgotten predictions of psychics who confidently promised the imminent arrest of the criminal. At present, the investigation has no official suspects or accused in the case. The memorial page for Ilya and Olya on the social network has been abandoned since 2014, but the internet has preserved their last photo together. According to rumors, the parents of the deceased teenagers have repeatedly asked to close the criminal case, but the law does not allow for such an option, and the investigators themselves do not intend to give up. The investigation continues. Subtitles. On an autumn day in 1980, it seems that a guest decided to visit the apartment in Chisinau where the Glukharyov family lived. A loud doorbell rang, immediately distracting all the household members from their daily chores. The head of the family, Feodosi, hurried to open the door. Imagine his surprise when he found no one on the landing, not a single living soul. But right in front of him stood a briefcase which, like something out of Alice in Wonderland, seemed to silently beg, "Open me." Intrigued and at the same time cautious, the man did just that. As soon as the clasp slid along the zipper with an unpleasant clatter, Feodosi felt as if she had been scalded with boiling water. Right from the briefcase, 2 empty eye sockets stared at him, carved with black charcoal on the severed head of an unknown woman. Unfortunately, due to YouTube's censorship, I can't show some documentary materials, so I'll leave them in the Telegram channel Strashnoti. Go ahead, subscribe and watch. The link is under the video. And before you find out what happened next, support the video with a like. It motivates me to create new videos and helps with promotion. Subscribe to the channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any new strange and scary stories. There was a piece of paper lying next to his head. In neat block letters, like a children's textbook, there was a threatening message. "Fedos, did you see the gift? Let this be a lesson to you. Prepare 10,000 or your daughter will lose her head too. Come to the station with the money tonight." Feodosi quickly recalled everyone in his life. He had no enemies, which was good, but there was also bad news. There was no money, not enough to satisfy the greed of the mysterious executioner, and that meant Glukharyov's daughter was now in danger. The case was immediately taken up by the investigators, led by the senior investigator Anatoly Magdalyuk. He immediately focused on investigating Feodosi himself. What reasons were there to intimidate him, and most importantly, who would do it? Unfortunately, identifying the victim was not possible. The head was severely disfigured, and this created a serious obstacle to announcing the name of the deceased. Feodosi Glukharyov was placed under surveillance, which revealed several interesting facts about him, including multiple affairs. Feodosi himself, openly admitting to infidelity, said that he was only in relationships with 2 mistresses, and both of them are safe safe and sound. Thus, the theory that the victim could have been his lover was pushed into the background. Later, a new assumption emerged. Maybe the crime out of jealousy was committed by one of Glukharyov's lovers, but that lead didn't yield any results. It was necessary to dig deeper and sort out every clue in this terrible case. Days went by, but no one was looking for the deceased woman. Then the investigators resorted to a trick. The head was shown on television, of course, with the permission of the leadership of the former Moldavian SSR.
Погибшую женщину никто не искал. Тогда следователи пошли на хитрый.
They didn't photograph it in its original state, as it could have caused psychological harm to viewers. Therefore, in the photo that was shown, the head did not look severed, and special plastic implants were inserted into the empty eye sockets. The next day, the police received the long-awaited call. 7-year-old Viktor Tarasin was shouting into the phone that it was his mother. "Bring her back," the boy pleaded tearfully. It was clear why the child was overwhelmed with emotion. Irina was raising her son alone, while also taking care of Viktor's sick grandmother. As it became known, Irina went to visit a friend for just half an hour. She wanted to talk about something personal, but she hadn't returned home for a whole week. Sometime after the identity of the deceased was established, little Vitya's grandmother also passed away, so the boy was placed in an orphanage. Who deprived the child of his mother's care? That was yet to be discovered. Meanwhile, Feodosy Glukharyov was once again sent another gruesome gift. In the silence, the same sudden chilling sound was heard, only this time, instead of a briefcase, there was a paper bag at the door.
Рядом лежала еще одна записка. Дари.
This time it contained a severed hand, and again it was a woman's. Next to it was another note. The sender clearly enjoyed using disgusting props to stage little performances. Fedos, still don't want to pay? Don't believe we aren't afraid of blood? Then kiss the woman's hand. In 3 days, bring the money to the station, or we'll cut your daughter to pieces. As a result of the examination, it was determined that the hand belonged to another victim. After the second crime, the whole of Kishinev, as they say, was up in arms. Among the townspeople, many rumors spread, including some very unusual ones. For example, some believed that it was all our doing. Among the townspeople, many rumors spread, including some very unusual ones. It was the work of sorcerers and necromancers who have a strong spiritual connection with the dead and use parts of the bodies of the deceased to achieve various goals. There were those who believed that a psychopathic ripper was operating in the city, even naming a specific person. This was the Kazakhstani maniac Nikolai Jumagaliev, a cannibal who murdered 9 women. They said that he escaped from a psychiatric clinic and is now hunting on the streets of Chisinau. Whatever theories existed in society, one thing was clear: an evil force was not going to
Бытовали в обществе, ясно было.
rest on its laurels, and the one who had to worry most about her fate was Oksana Glukhareva, Feodosy's daughter. That's why the girl was assigned protection. One day near her house, the officers noticed an unknown man. When Oksana went outside for some reason, he immediately headed toward her. The vigilant officers just in case grabbed a stranger, and the girl almost in tears asked them to let him go. Uncle Sasha is a good man, she said, adding that he is a friend of their family, a kind and reliable person, Alexander Srenik. They left the man alone. Meanwhile, the deadline set for Feodosy by the extortionist was approaching. Police said the only escape was to arrange a meeting between Glukharyov and the note authors. The meeting took place at Kishinev train station. Only Feodosy himself showed up and waited there amid the rumble of trains until late in the evening. Most likely, the bandits sensed that things were getting dangerous and decided not to expose themselves by carelessly arriving at a crowded place. Anatoly Magdalyuk, who enthusiastically led this investigation, the channel, decided not to expose themselves by carelessly arriving at a crowded place. Anatoly Magdalyuk, who enthusiastically led this investigation, decided that it was necessary to pay attention to other details of the crimes. He began to examine everything thoroughly. He pored over each note, hoping to find something to latch onto, and he did. The unknown person always addressed Glukharyov rather familiarly, Fedos. This was Fyodor's childhood nickname, which he didn't really like. Only the closest people called him that. The circle of suspects immediately narrowed significantly. The first to be questioned was Glukharyov's second cousin, Dmitry Kozintsev. The thing is, Kozintsev had a reason to take revenge on his relative. He stole Feodosy's fiancée, and Feodosy reacted quite aggressively to that. He chased the scoundrel with a knife, promising to take his life. The disgraced ladies' man Kozintsev became furious that time and verbally threatened his rival. Moreover, the suspect was engaged in profiteering and was actively hiding behind his respectable position as the director of the dining car. In short, a cunning, self-serving man, a potential criminal if there ever was one. But no, it wasn't him. Too cowardly to be a calculating maniac, Kozintsev confessed honestly that stealing was more his thing, but when it comes to taking a life, he simply isn't capable of it at all. Soon, a new event shook Kishinev. It happened in the Central Park, a place that seemed to be the most peaceful. But for the young Olga Lebedeva, from that moment on, it became a symbol of horror. That's where she was attacked. A man tried to sexually assault the girl, but Olga was not going to stand by and do nothing. Fortunately, she had a comb with her, which served as a weapon. With all her strength, she hit him in the groin with it, and despite the shock of pain, he chased after her, shouting all kinds of curses. "I'll cut you into pieces." That's what the frightened Lebedeva heard as the menacing figure chased her with giant strides from behind. However, she still managed to escape. Not far from the place where Olga was nearly killed, the body of Irina Trosin was found, which led to certain suspicions about a connection between the girl's attacker and the brutal Ripper. When Lebedeva was being interrogated, she said that she had met a guy who flooded her with love letters. However, after giving her a bouquet of flowers on their first date, he suddenly left the meeting place, and half an hour later, the girl almost became the victim of a maniac. The investigators decided to study Olga's admirers' letters. They quickly identified the sender. It was that very Uncle Sasha whose release Oksana, Feodosi's daughter, had pleaded for. Everyone was shocked. However, there was a small inconsistency that still needed some explanation. The letters sent to Lebedeva were written in regular handwriting, while those to Glukharyov were in block letters, so it was difficult to confirm that they were written by the same person. The investigators immediately came up with a brilliant idea. Alexander Skrinik was invited to the military enlistment office to fill out documents for military training. To make it look like a routine event and to avoid arousing suspicion, 24 more people joined him. The suspect was warned that the documents had to be filled out in block letters. After such an experiment, there were no doubts left. Handwriting experts assured the police that the terrifying notes were written by Alexander Skrinik. Uncle Sasha was detained. He tried to deny the accusation, behaved defiantly, and openly displayed aggression. He only realized he was truly caught when they presented him with written evidence created by his own hand. After that, a whole wave of confessions from the maniac suddenly poured out to the investigators. Alexander had always been envious of his classmates, his fellow students, his co-workers, friends, colleagues at the Bucurie factory, and all because of his unsuccessful family life. He was married, but almost immediately after the wedding, he realized that he had no feelings for his wife. They already had a child, and this fact only deepened Alexander's intense hatred. The one who annoyed Skrinik the most was his friend Feodosi. He confidently boasted about his romantic achievements without showing a drop of empathy for his hopeless friend. In his despair, Skrinik wrote an ad in the newspaper to meet at least one suitable person, but he had no luck there either. The first girl he met infected him with a venereal disease. Alexander fell into a rage, deciding that women were the cause of all misfortunes. They absolutely need to be gotten rid of, and he will take the first step toward carrying out this grand mission. The first victim of the maniac was the stewardess Nina Puganova, whose breasts and genitals he cut out. This happened in Yakutsk, where Skrinik had come to work. The second to meet her death was Irina Trosin, already in Chisinau. After beheading her, Alexander presented the trophy to Glukharyov and at the same time decided to make a considerable fortune from this vile act. The maniac's third victim, Anastasia Mikhailova, Skrinik cut off her hand, which was later given as a gift to the same Glukharyov. The criminal did not feel any remorse for taking the lives of these women. He called himself the forest's caretaker and Skrinik, apparently imitating a woodpecker that rids its home of persistent parasites. During the hearing, the accused immediately warned that he would share gruesome details of his crimes, so the most sensitive people present should leave. He spoke about the atrocities easily and casually in the same tone people use to tell everyday stories. When asked why he chose this path, he replied, "I couldn't stop, I enjoyed the process." The Supreme Court of the Moldavian SSR sentenced Alexander Skrinic to death. The execution was carried out, but the exact date is unknown.